But thanks for that introduction, Delane, and thanks to Monty and to the Iowa Renewable Fuels Association for the opportunity to speak with you all today. And I also want to thank Deputy Secretary Sinski. I know he's already left the room and is on to other things. But you all should know that there is no more effective advocate for agriculture and the biofuels industry in our nation's capital than Deputy Secretary Steve Sinski. So it's great that he was able to join us here today. You know, as I looked at the agenda and I saw that I was sandwiched in between Monty's State of the Industry address and following Deputy Secretary Sinski, and then we've got a policy roundtable discussion this afternoon, it occurred to me that if I'm not careful, you're going to hear the same recap of 2019 policy and regulatory issues 3 or 4 times today. So I'm going to hopefully avoid retreading some of the same ground that's already been covered or will be covered elsewhere today, but I do want to start by saying a few words at least about the year we just completed. And I'm really not going to sugarcoat it. As my 2 teenage kids would say, 2019 really sucked. And, you know, I honestly tried to come up with a more polite or maybe more eloquent way of saying that, but no other term really seemed to capture the essence of 2019 nearly as well. It sucked. What made 2019 such an especially frustrating year for us is that our policy and regulatory wins were often overshadowed by new obstacles and unexpected setbacks. As Monty articulated so well this morning, the renewable fuels industry secured some important victories in 2019. After 10 years of relentless effort, we finally got EPA to eliminate the ridiculous summertime prohibition on E15 sales in conventional gasoline markets. And we succeeded in ensuring that the final rule was not compromised by any RIN reform poison pills. In June, we had President Trump visit Southwest Iowa Renewable Energy in Council Bluffs to celebrate the E15 announcement. It was just the 4th time in history that a sitting U.S. president had visited an ethanol plant. And in response to an unrelenting campaign by farmers and biofuel producers, President Trump directed EPA in the fall to prospectively reallocate RFS volumes that were lost to small refinery exemptions in 2020 and beyond. And while EPA's final rule didn't turn out exactly the way we were looking for, and it ultimately did not adopt the methodology that we were hoping for and had recommended, it does mark a significant improvement over the original proposal, and it does give us an outside chance of finally achieving that 15 billion gallon requirement established by law. EPA also withdrew its proposed rule that would have reset the 2021 and 2022 RFS volumes. Based on what we were hearing about that reset proposal, it definitely needed to go back to the drawing board, and so that was good news. EPA also said it would revisit a court order to restore 500 million gallons of illegally waived RFS requirements from 2016. And that was a change, of course, because earlier in the year they had said that they were going to ignore that court-ordered remand. And then finally, we got a firm commitment from the administration, and you just heard about some of this from Mr. Sinski, that the administration was going to facilitate greater investment in biofuels infrastructure and streamline or eliminate the ridiculous remaining regulatory impediments on E15, things like that bright orange pump label that you see when you pull up to the pump. So in any other year, I think we'd look at that list of accomplishments and say, we did really well with our policy and regulatory agenda. But the hard truth is this: the marketplace, not the DC bureaucracy, is the ultimate arbiter of our success. And at every turn in 2019, it seemed our hard-fought victories were eclipsed by new impediments and a general sense of malaise and cynicism in the marketplace. The incremental demand growth that our industry has become accustomed to and had really been promised by the renewable fuel standard has simply not materialized in recent years. You planned for growth. In anticipation of new markets and new demand, you adopted new technologies and invested in expansion projects. But that promise of new demand evaporated when trade wars crimped the ethanol export opportunity and EPA doled out dozens of secret small refinery exemptions. But there was a silver lining to 2019, and I can say without equivocation or hyperbole that the biofuels industry pulled together and circled the wagons more tightly in 2019 than we've ever done before. The legal and regulatory teams at RFA and Growth Energy worked arm in arm in the spring to ensure EPA and the administration delivered an airtight and legally defensible E15 rule in record time. In the span of just 80 days, EPA proposed the rule, received 33,000 public comments, held a public hearing, analyzed those comments, prepared a draft final rule, got it through the White House for review, and published the final regulations. That was totally unprecedented. I have never seen anything move through EPA that quickly, and it would not have happened had we not been working very closely together as an industry to facilitate that. And in August, following the announcement of 31 more small refinery exemptions, we banded together with our biofuel allies and our partners in agriculture to mount a tenacious campaign demanding that the administration reverse the demand destruction and make it right. We coordinated daily with our friends at NCGA, the National Biodiesel Board, Farm Bureau, National Farmers Union, American Soybean Association, Growth Energy, American Coalition for Ethanol, Fuels America. We were all working together on a daily basis, including the state groups, especially those here in Iowa, led by Iowa Renewable Fuels Association and Iowa Corn. Because our message was clear and completely unified, we were able to quickly rally and empower our political champions to join the fight, and fight they did. We owe a tremendous debt of gratitude to our champions for their efforts, especially your elected officials here in Iowa, Senators Ernst and Grassley, Governor Reynolds, Secretary Neg. They were with us every step of the way, and we thank them for that. Absolutely. And I think everyone involved would agree when I say that we gave it our best effort and left it all in the field in 2019. There is no way anyone could argue that the biofuels industry wasn't completely unified in our defense of the RFS and response to the SRE disaster. We had one consistent message, and we spoke with a powerful voice. But that's enough about 2019. Like I said, we're going to hear plenty more about these developments later this afternoon, and you've already heard a lot about them. 2019 is in the past, and I want to focus forward. We're starting a new year and a new decade, and it's time for a fresh start. So it was Charles Kettering, some of you may know who that is, and I'll say a few more words about him in a minute, who said, "Every time you tear a leaf off a calendar, you present a new place for new ideas and progress." And I think he's absolutely right. And I know I, for one, and I'm sure I'm joined by many of you, was very anxious to tear that last leaf off of the calendar in 2019 and start a fresh year. But there is some irony here. Charles Kettering, if that's a familiar name to you, it's probably because he was the head of research and development at General Motors in the 1920s and a fairly well-known inventor. But he was the first to discover that a high-level blend of ethanol in gasoline could enable more efficient, high-compression engines. But guess what? GM couldn't patent the use of ethanol in gasoline, and the oil guys didn't really like that idea anyway. So instead, Kettering teamed up with Standard Oil to invent tetraethyl lead as a way of boosting octane and increasing engine efficiency. And thus, leaded gasoline was born. So I think that's a pretty good lesson in what happens when new ideas and new progress collide with the oil industry's money and influence. We need to ensure that our new ideas and progress in this new decade don't meet a similar fate. And so bearing that in mind, I want to offer quickly 4 ethanol predictions for the new decade that we're just beginning. Number 1, the RFS battles will continue and they will intensify. Okay, this may be the safest prediction I've ever made. Certainly safer than my bet on the Baltimore Ravens last weekend. It's no secret that the oil industry hates the renewable fuel standard, and it's easy to see why. The RFS has created access to a market that is otherwise closed to competition. The RFS has taken a big bite out of the oil industry's market share and reduced demand for petroleum products. That's what it was supposed to do. But we know our opponents will continue to attack the RFS using every tactic available, And of course, we'll have a counterpunch ready for every one of their jabs. They'll continue to lobby Congress and the administration to undermine the program. They'll fund junk science and run negative ads. They'll continue to look for clever loopholes for avoiding compliance. They'll spread myths and misinformation about ethanol, the RFS, and RINs. They will continue to sue EPA at every turn. And in fact, the oil industry has already announced its intentions to take EPA to court over the just finalized 2020 RVO rule. But we continue to take legal action against EPA as well when there is no other recourse. We are never eager to litigate, but sometimes our only hope of getting EPA to follow the law is to go to the court system. RFA is currently involved in 4 pending cases on the RFS, and in one of those cases, we are expecting a ruling fairly soon. In the spring of 2018, RFA was joined by the National Corn Growers Association, ACE, and the National Farmers Union in bringing a little-noticed, kind of under-the-radar lawsuit against EPA in the 10th Circuit. And it challenged the waivers that were granted to 3 specific refineries. That case has moved along nicely and represents, in my opinion, our industry's best hope in the near term for assuring fair treatment in the small refinery exemption process. Oral arguments in that case were held last November, and again, a favorable ruling in the 10th Circuit could fundamentally change the way EPA handles its small refinery exemption program. These legal skirmishes are sure to continue on the RFS. And with 2022 just around the corner, new battle lines are being drawn on the RFS as well. I'm sure you've heard this before, but it bears repeating. The RFS does not end in 2022. But what does end in 2022 is the certainty of specific annual RFS volumes prescribed by law. In other words, EPA will have far more discretion to set the RFS volumes in 2023 and beyond than they have today. We know refiners are already working to recast the post-2022 RFS into something that limits the use of ethanol and other biofuels and fails to drive further growth. We cannot let that happen. That's why we're redoubling our efforts to ensure that the RFS remains intact as the transformative and growth-oriented program that Congress intended it to be in 2023 and well beyond. But we certainly have our work cut out for us, and it will take all of us working together to continue protecting and defending the RFS. Prediction number 2, the spread of the low-carbon fuel standard. As we enter a new decade, state and federal action on carbon reduction and climate change appears inevitable and imminent. Since the 116th Congress began about a year ago, more than 40 bills and resolutions focused on climate change have been introduced. Speaker Pelosi has said she will put comprehensive climate change legislation on the floor for a House vote before November. And whether federal climate legislation goes any further than that, of course, will depend entirely on the outcome of the elections. But regardless of what happens at the federal level, or perhaps because of what doesn't happen at the federal level, states across the country are moving ahead with their own programs and their own plans and policies aimed at decarbonization. And because the transportation sector has emerged as the single largest source of greenhouse gas emissions, there's a lot of focus on fuels and vehicles. And one very promising policy that they look at as a way to contain emissions from transportation is a low-carbon fuel standard. Of course, the LCFS isn't new. You all know that California has had an LCFS program in place for about 10 years now. And Oregon has an active program. Washington came close to passing LCFS legislation last year, and they just this week reintroduced that bill. And efforts are also underway to adopt LCFS programs in New York, Colorado, New Mexico, and a 10-state regional program is being discussed in the Mid-Atlantic and New England. And then closer to home for most of you, there are ongoing discussions surrounding the potential for a state or regional low-carbon fuel standard in the upper Midwest. Over the past 2 years, the Great Plains Institute has convened a broad and diverse group of stakeholders to discuss the potential features of a Midwest low-carbon fuel standard program. And I like to call it LCFS done right. If we were going to do LCFS in our neck of the woods, What would it look like? Some of you have been involved in that process, and RFA has been proud to be on the steering committee for that group, along with ACE and others. And just last week, this group released a new white paper outlining our principles and recommendations for what a Midwest program could look like. And so I would encourage you to check that out. But what does a resurgent interest in the low carbon fuel standard policy model really mean for ethanol in the long term? You know, at RFA, we believe that low carbon fuel programs present a tremendous opportunity for ethanol producers. The experience in California and Oregon has shown us that when you put a value on carbon, it creates new economic opportunities, stimulates investment in new technology, and facilitates innovation and creativity in the retail market. You know, believe it or not, E85 consumption is growing faster in California than any other state in the country. And now RFA is working with state regulators on the process to finally get E15 approved in the state of California, and that's because of the LCFS. That's what opened that door. We didn't always have a favorable view of the California low carbon program, as many of you know. I was heavily involved in the rulemaking process in 2008 and 2009 when that program was being put together. And based on incredibly flawed modeling, at that time, California regulators were assuming that corn ethanol and gasoline were about the same in terms of their carbon intensity and their impact on emissions. And so we obviously had concern that ethanol would be dead on arrival in 2011 when this program began implementation. But we didn't give up. We continued to share reams of real-world data with CARB. We funded research to improve the models. We sponsored workshops to educate California stakeholders about the efficiency of modern farming practices and ethanol production improvements. And while we still have work to do to ensure that CARB's modeling more accurately represents what we are doing in the industry today, we have come a long, long way in 10 years with the California program. In fact, CARB's most recent data show that corn ethanol is responsible for about 40% of the total greenhouse gas emissions reductions achieved since the LCFS began. And CARB data also show that ethanol used in California is reducing greenhouse gas emissions by an average of 37% compared to gasoline. You heard Mr. Sinsky say that USDA's analysis says 39%. So the Californians are not far off of that today, and that's a far cry from where they started out when this program began, when they assumed a very modest reduction of about 8%. Our bridge building with California and other supporters of the LCFS continues. Last summer, RFA and the National Corn Growers Association hosted CARB's executive officer, Richard Corey, and several of his staff members, regulators from other West Coast states, and several representatives from the environmental community for a tour of the Midwest ethanol industry. We took them to Siouxland Ethanol and Elite Octane here in Iowa, where they learned more about the innovation and technology that is reducing the carbon intensity of corn ethanol. And we took them to Iowa farms. Most of them had never been to an ethanol plant or farm, where they learned more about the incredible productivity and efficiency of the American farmer and the enormous potential for cornfields to serve as significant carbon sinks. So as more states adopt LCFS programs, we'll need to continue our outreach to these important stakeholders, and we'll keep working to position corn and corn ethanol as part of the climate solution. The other thing we've got to do is ensure that any new policies around carbon also account for the significant role that ethanol's high octane rating can play in enhancing vehicle efficiency and reducing carbon emissions even further. Tying ethanol's low carbon and high octane properties together is the optimal solution for decarbonizing our liquid fuels in the years ahead. So prediction number 3, as the trade wars thaw, we think U.S. ethanol exports will resume vigorous growth. At the beginning of the last decade, the U.S. was a net importer of ethanol. In fact, in the 5 years spanning 2005 to 2009, U.S. ethanol imports averaged more than 400 million gallons per year, all from Brazil, and our exports averaged just 100 million gallons annually. At that time, very few in the industry could have possibly imagined that 2009 would be the last year we would be a net importer of ethanol. And no one could have guessed that by the end of the decade, the U.S. ethanol industry would be exporting 1 out of every 10 gallons that we're producing. Our transition from a net importer to an export powerhouse over the past 10 years is a remarkable success story, and we should all be proud of that. It not only demonstrates the resourcefulness of our industry, but also the incredible value of ethanol on the world market. But after 5 successive years of growth in ethanol exports, we saw a step backward in 2019 as a result of protectionist trade barriers. China's 70% tariff on fuel ethanol imports shut us out of that market, which was once our third leading destination for U.S. ethanol exports. Meanwhile, Brazil's tariff on over-quota U.S. ethanol imports led to lost opportunities in that market as well. And Mexico continued to prohibit the use of ethanol in its 3 largest metropolitan areas. But as 2020 begins, however, there are signs of hope that things will soon improve in the export market. We learned just yesterday, as you heard from Mr. Sinsky, that fuel ethanol is indeed included in the Phase 1 trade deal with China, and that country remains committed to using ethanol as a way to address air quality concerns. In Brazil, negotiations are ongoing with regard to their tariff rate quota, and we continue to encourage our counterparts in Brazil to return to the free and fair trade relationship we enjoyed with the world's #2 leading ethanol producer between 2012 and 2017. Longer term, we see vast potential to grow ethanol exports. And I know you're going to hear much more about that on a panel discussion this afternoon. But the untapped demand is enormous, and the value proposition is undeniable. Outside of the United States and Brazil, there are roughly 250 billion gallons of gasoline consumed each year. And today, it contains just 2% ethanol on average. So if we simply moved to E10 worldwide, we would grow demand by some 18 billion gallons globally. Let's go get it. So my fourth and final prediction is at some point in this decade, we are going to see E15 be the new standard grade of gasoline at the pump. Just as E10 is today, sometime before 2030, we have that expectation for E15. It's been almost 8 years since RFA helped a retail station in Lawrence, Kansas become the first in the nation to sell E15. And we've come a long way since then, but we still have a very long way to go. Today, E15 is sold at more than 2,000 retail stations across the country. Billions of miles have been traveled on the fuel. More than 95% of the cars, SUVs, and pickups on the road today are legally approved to use E15, and close to half of those vehicles carry the explicit warranty coverage or endorsement of the automaker to use the fuel as well. So in addition to finally securing EPA approval to sell E15 year-round, there were other positive developments for E15 in 2019 that will help us expand the market. New York, which is the nation's 4th largest gasoline market, finally approved the use of E15, and we saw more and more terminals across the U.S. begin to offer pre-blended E15 at the rack in 2019. These are important steps in the market. But the fact remains, E15 is offered at less than 2% of the nation's 130,000 retail gas stations today. We've got more work to do. But I wanted to take a look back at history, and you know, we can't forget that it took 25 years after the commercial introduction of E10 to even get to about a quarter of the marketplace. 25 years before we had 1 out of every 4 gallons of gasoline being sold as E10. But then when you look at what happened between 2003 and 2010, just 7 years, we saw hockey stick growth in E10. And it went from about 20% of the market to almost 100% of the market in less than a decade. And it happened quickly due to a combination of factors: the phase out of MTBE, the adoption of the RFS 1 and RFS 2, the blender's tax credit, state laws, and the refining sector's transition to sub-octane gasoline blend stocks. It can happen like this too. It can happen quickly for E15. E15's lower cost and margin potential already makes it an attractive option for retailers and marketers. But what will be the catalyst that really creates hockey stick growth and that hockey stick moment for E15? If EPA actually finally enforces a 15 billion gallon RFS in 2020 and beyond, and the RIN markets begin to show signs of life, that could create a spark. Approval of E15 in California could turn that spark into a flame. More LCFS programs could turn that flame into a fire. And retooling of gasoline bobs for 15% ethanol or a requirement for higher minimum octane ratings could turn that fire into a blaze. And by 2030, we could be in a situation where E15 is as ubiquitous as E10 is today in the marketplace. So there you have it, and I'm trying to keep us on schedule. Those were my 4 predictions for the new decade, and I guess I would just close simply by adding a 5th, and that is that ethanol's best and brightest days are ahead of us because of the people in this room and the people across our industry, and I look forward to working with all of you as we enter the roaring 20s. Thank you so much.